All right, options 8 through 14. The more fun option is going to be presented by Jason. Any questions on 1 through 7 real quick? Great, thank you.
All right. I don't know if they're more fun, but they're more challenging probably. So most of the ones that we already covered were in the original EPP that was Fort Bend, Harris County, so they were able to kind of carry that template over, but they had to add a few additional ones. There's bigger and better things that could be used as backup for emergency preparedness. So we're covering some of those. I will kind of preface this to say that, in anything that you're choosing, it really should not be just a compliance checkbox. You need to read through this and go through this enough to make it make sense. You have to justify what option you pick. And you'll kind of see what I'm talking about through the following options, because it may not really apply to give you that required 20 PSI when you're out of power for more than 24 hours. That was just my own personal opinion I threw in there, so I'll just let you know that. All right, so starting with option 8, I will be going through the EPP template. I'm going to be reading right off of here a lot, so if you have that in front of you, I'd suggest kind of following along with me. So for option 8B, or A, sorry, option 8A, it is for the designation of water system as a critical load facility. So if you are able to work with your TDU or your power provider and get a designation that you have a dedicated line to your plant or your facilities, you can use this as an option. But you do have to have letters or some kind of documentation proving up that this has been. And you can see, starting with A on page 21, you have to have the named electrical provider, a copy of the letter of them stating that it is a dedicated line. You have to have a diagram including all the information in section 2, where it lays out all of your pumps, your chlorine equipment, everything that's going to be ran in that system. You have to include all of the information to be able to supply with this option. I don't know of many utilities at this point that have dedicated lines. It's not saying that it can't be done, but it may be an investment to work with your power utility to get this completed. Option 8B, another version, is designation of water system having a redundant or isolated. One second. I think I crossed those two.
Question, Jason?
Yes.
We got our critical load, but from AEP, but they always put that disclaimer on the back end. This may not. Is
Yes.
that still going to be good enough to file it as an 8A with that disclaimer?
So you're still getting the designation, but it says it even in the template that you can get the designation, but it's nothing to say that it's going to give you the power. Just because you have the piece of paper that says you are a designated critical load facility doesn't mean it's going to be fail-proof. That's why there is a suggestion to pick more than one option. And I will say that if you find one that fits you, I would not just carry on through the rest of the document and skip it. Find everything that does apply, so you have some redundancy. This is great. If you have critical load facility status, that's fantastic, but there is an option that may not work. As we saw in February, it didn't work for a lot of people. And I did get kind of mixed up a little bit, sorry. Okay, so 8A, was just the critical load status. And that is something that we were required to go out and retrieve right now. You're supposed to reach out to your TDUs and your retail providers to try to get that status. Whether they can give it to you or not, and I know it's been mentioned multiple times already, that's one thing. Option 8B is the dedicated line, to see if you can have a dedicated electrical feed to your facility. And again, if you have that, you have to submit a diagram, documentation showing that you do have that in place. But even with that, it's the same kind of caveat. It's not to say that just because you have a dedicated line that the substation feeding that facility is not going to also be down. So that's why I say in all of these options, I would really think about the possibility of more redundancy. To check the box and get it, to hit the compliance by the compliance date, just because you've selected, say, option 8A or 8B, is good, but the idea is to make sure you are prepared for this emergency moving forward. All right, moving on to option 9. On page 26 of the template, providing water storage capabilities. So with the requirement of maintaining 20 psi, we're looking for useful water storage. And it has a diagram on the backside or page 27 of kind of showing you that it's above the pumping level and below the overflow level. But that also is dependent on where you are as far as hydrology or where you're going to be in your system. You know, the elevations. So if your storage tank is, say, down in a sump and part of your utility, then your useful storage may not be at the pump level. It may be halfway up the tank because you have to find wherever it is that it's going to apply that 20 psi. And if you do the 20 psi and the mathematics from groundwater class when we did our D, you can add it up to it's about 40 feet to hit that 20 psi, depending on where your tank is in your system. So you can't just take it right off the bat that it is based on this picture and that from pumping level to overflow, that's my useful storage. As you can see in the template, there is a description and it is paired with a diagram that we're going to go over in just a few minutes. But you can see that it is explained in here that it does ask in option 8A, we are going to use this option, but then how are you going to refill that tank? How long can that tank storage last you? And then how are you going to get water back into it to continue this process? It will, throughout the questions, A through E, it does ask you, based on your maximum daily demand, how long will this last? So depending on what you fill out, what you submit to CCQ, it's going to see if it's really justifiable that this is a good option for you. If you say this is going to last you a quarter of a day, this isn't really a good plan. Sorry, I was a little behind on that. Option 10. This also is an AB. So water delivered to your distribution system outside of your service area for emergency interconnects. Just for a show of hands real quick, who has interconnects with neighboring cities? That's a good percentage. Most of the time, well, I say most of the time, the last 3 workshops, it's varying, maybe 2 hands tops. And that has something to do with where we were located in Texas, because there is not a lot of neighbors out north and west. But it is important, outside of preparedness plans or not, it is good to have that relationship with your neighboring systems. Outside of a Uri, outside of a hurricane or a tornado, just having that reliance that you have a neighbor that you're going to have that backup and help one another out. So if you do not have those interconnections, whether you're going for option 10A or not, I do encourage you to make those calls, those contacts. So for an interconnect for 10A, you're going to provide the information here, a map of your distribution system, where your connection points are. Is it direct pressure from what they're feeding, or is the interconnect going to be filling up one of your storage tanks? So you go through the options, and one being on number C, letter C, on page 28. Is it going to be the same type of disinfection? You know, that's going to be a key point. I know during an emergency, a mixture of free chlorine versus chloramines may not be a game changer, or, you know, it may not be the biggest issue at the time, because the idea is to get water. But you definitely want to plan ahead, because it discusses in here, do you have a way to notify your customers? Does the system have currently a valid blending exception? So there are plans in place or things in place to get accomplished before you can say this is a valid option for you as well. 10B, using water haulers. So water coming in from outside of your service area, but through a water hauler. I know there are a lot of people out in the central Texas area that this is the primary way they get water in the first place. So this is nothing new to them. With this option, you do have to consider, again, in Uri, there weren't a lot of people on the road. So getting water hauled into your system was not a likely chance. I know for TRWA, taking generators out to try to get some power going for utilities, it was very limited of what we could do for our emergency response because we couldn't get on the road. So take that into consideration with all factors of what could possibly be the reason that you're out of power for more than 24 hours. In a freeze situation, water hauling may not be very feasible. Any questions so far? I am kind of running through this fairly quick, but we do have 2 hours at the end, so you can ask more questions at that point. Option 11, page 30. The ability to provide water through an artesian flow. From my understanding, there aren't a lot of approved artesian wells or sources in Texas currently, but it is still in here as an option. So being able to justify that, to say that it is enough water to actually fill up storage and still provide that 20 PSI, it's possible. If you do have that out there, that's some serious flow, but you can use this option. And then option 12. I said that as if we were coming to the end, but there's a couple more, isn't it? Redundant interconnectivity between pressure zones. Many utilities, smaller utilities, have one pressure zone across the board. They may have 1 or 2 storage tanks. They're on the same pressure plane, so there's no cross between one or the other. But the larger you get and more of the elevation, Central Texas or out where I'm at and around Fort Hood, the hill country plays a big part. So pressure zones vary, and you have it isolated from one side of the system to another. So if you have that ability to say if one well is down and you can open up a valve and connect a pressure zone from one to another to provide water to this side of your system, this is an option. This is also going to want you to explain how to justify having your whole system still run off of this. So if only part is down, this is a good fit. But if your entire system or the entire area is down and out of power, you may need an additional option for this. I'm really following this, and I'm forgetting about the slides. My bad. All right, option 13. Use of water demand rules to maintain emergency operations. So this is one that would actually pair well with the water storage. If you do have excess water storage and you can provide that 20 PSI with water storage, but also implement option 13 to say that you're going to put restrictions on your users. Once you hit a certain level of an emergency, have those policies in place. They're approved. The customers know about it. That has been used and proved up to work in some cases. But again, just doing this alone may or may not be a good fit for your system, but maybe in conjunction or paired with something else, it could be. So this is really relating to water restrictions for your customer use. And option 14. Now I can say it as we're closing. Any other alternate method? So anything outside of the other 13 that has been kind of thought up for you that may be a possibility, what else do you got? What else can you come up with? I put this in here. I did mention that as with TRWA, I do the emergency response, and we go out and provide generators and assistance during an event. One thing that we did start doing, and we have one of these, and we're going to build 1 or 2 more. This is something that we pulled from Florida Rural Water. They are very savvy when it comes to emergencies because they deal with them every year. So they're very creative. If you are interested in looking at any of the other stuff that they have, there's a website at the bottom. It should be on your slides as well. But check it out. They have a build for this right here. This is a small 15 kW generator, something you could buy at Lowe's, Home Depot, and then a VFD. So what we have this for is, in most cases, when we're going out for emergency response, we get calls for lift stations. Everybody has gotten pretty savvy with the idea of keeping water flowing, but then where's it going? That's the issue. So they don't always have generators on lift stations, wastewater plants. So for a lift station, small pump, this is a good fit for that, and that's what we use it for. But if you have a small well, say a 10-horse well or something like that, typically you would need a generator of size to run everything that you have with disinfection, with lighting, with your controls, with everything that needs to be considered. But if you just consider the pump itself, something small like this, these generators typically are just single-phase power, but with a VFD, you're transferring single-phase to 3-phase. You can run a lot larger motor with 15 kW, because you can ramp it up and run it 20%. It's not going to be at full capacity, but you are at least moving some water at that point. So it's a creative idea that Florida came up with. We stole it. I like them. But it may be a good fit if you want to say that this may be an option and it's justifiable that it'll work for your system. This is in 14 because it doesn't really fit a mobile generator. It's definitely not fixed. It's kind of a hodgepodge of things. So I wanted to put an example of that in here. All right, so that's with the options, 1 through 14. Any questions on that at the moment? Okay. All right, I did want to touch on system diagrams and schematics. They do talk about that towards the beginning of the template. In section 1, it asks for a diagram of your water system. So submitting a diagram of your drinking water system that shows all your equipment, your tanks, your pumps, all of the components that basically are going to require power during this emergency. And when we talk about what that should look like, what it should include, TCEQ has put together an example. Now, I will just say from experience so far that they don't say that it has to be like this, but this is a good layout of what they're looking for. They need to see where all the components of it are. We have assisted some other systems that they've put it together with pen and ruler or using the paint program on Microsoft. Those are always fun. So you don't have to necessarily do it this way, but try to make it clear and legible of what you're trying to explain. Also with this, you'll notice that if you pair up this diagram, and for the people online, it should be in the same folder next to the template. But if you'll pair up these two, the example EPP with this diagram, you'll see that there at the bottom, they're including what options they're suggesting for this plant number 1. For example, they installed a diesel generator to operate the well, the treatment, and the pumps. And so that's option number 1. They put a diagram out there. They explain what option they're using. That's kind of what they're looking for from TCEQ. For their plant number 2, they're using option 2A. And I should know this off head right, by this point, but I don't. Yeah, you're relying on someone else. So relying on the City of Dublin for their water for option 2A. So they have an interconnection here, and that's how they plan to get through a power outage for their system. For their plant 3, they're using 2B, so they have mutual aid for text warn. And then they're also using option 4 with a mobile generator. Pretty simplistic, just basic layout. What do you have? What option you're using? And how does it make sense? For plant 4, option 7, they actually have a right angle drive on that well, which again has to be already installed, not go out and purchase one and put it on now. They're also using option, that's option 7, sorry. Oh, sorry, I thought that was someone asking a question. And option 4 for the mobile generator. Plant 5, using option 3A because they are leasing equipment. That's the game plan for this particular plant. And they're also using option 10A. This one is a much larger facility, so it's on 2 slides here. But I believe, I have it all in one on this one. So I believe the idea was just to show you that it can be more complex for those of you that have more on a facility or for site. So just an example of what that really looks like, what they're looking for from source to distribution. On the schematics for section 2, when you're talking about the electrical components, what your requirements are for your pumps, the kilowatts, the horsepower, all of that, it does ask for electrical schematic as well. I put this together. This is why I kind of touted the paint program, because I used to get everything done by a paint program. And I put this together. It's very simple. I can't say that this is an approved TCEQ what they want to see, but based on what I'm picking up in the EPP template, this is an example. They want to see what is in there, what is connected. I don't think it has to be as detailed to the point or degree of saying it's a 30 amp breaker, it's 3 legs here, it's located in this box, it's a square D panel. I don't think all of that is necessary. They just want to see basic layout and diagram of where your electrical components are For example, for your pumps, your chlorine pumps, any kind of chemical feed, your well, a demonstration of where your incoming power is, if you have automatic switchover for generators. They just want to know where all the power components are. Okay. I just wanted to touch on those two things as well. We didn't really cover them anywhere else, that the schematics and diagrams are a part of submitting your EPP. So with submitting, once you're done with all this, you've picked your option, you've completed all of the work that goes into section 1 and 2 of all the details of your system. Now it's time to submit. You have two options. You can email or snail mail, but do not do both. I'm assuming that with around 4,000, they just don't want duplicates. They don't want to see it again. Preferred is email. Is that correct? Okay. We do have some TCQ here, and I was told not to point them out. So that's why I just kind of stared vaguely into the crowd, waiting for a nod. Anyway, sorry, rabbit trail. So distributing the approved EPP. Once you have submitted to TCQ, they have approved it. You have their blessing. It's going to be just fine how it is. No changes or alterations need to be made. You do get a copy or a letter saying it is approved. And then now you can send out the approved version to the additional people listed here, but also in the back of your template. So your county judge, County Office of Emergency Management, or EMC, if you have one of those in your county, most do. Public Utility Commission, which this is a little different than your initial filing.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Real quick. Has the TCQ put out any information or the PUC on how all of these entities, as well as themselves, intend to keep this information confidential? All right, if we're firing these things back and forth via email, all this data contains Homeland Security level information about all of our systems. And so my concern is that we're putting all this out there and there's no protection to keep it isolated like it ought to be.
That is a good point. And yes, there is information about the inner workings of your system, I mean, down to the schematics. So that is very true. And I know for the PUC, they do have a separate filing for confidential filing. Because right now, anytime you file something with the PUC, it is open record. You can search it. But they do have a method through PUC of doing that confidential. Now, as far as your county judge, your EMC, Texas Department of Emergency Management, I do not know their processes. Most of the time at these workshops so far, when you ask me a question I can't answer, I just point at Elston. But I don't know that he can answer that either. Do you have any?
No guidance has gotten put out yet. And so
Right.
I guess for the TCQ that are in the room, is there an intention to put out guidance on how to maintain this confidential?
So the question was, is there any intention of putting out guidance on how to maintain this confidentially? He'll have to get you back there.
Here we go. All right. I don't know that there's any guidance that's planned, but that's a great point. And so this has been done, again, in 2 counties, and this process was followed. I know that typically, routinely, as Jason mentioned, PUC has their confidential filing. So you file that way, that will be confidential. With the Texas Division of Emergency Management, well, that's what they do, right? And so they have a dedicated email address for it. And so anything that's submitted there, my understanding, I can't speak for them, my understanding that information is confidential as well. Now, submitting it to your county judge or Office of Emergency Management, that I don't know, but it's in the legislation that you have to submit it to them. So, that may be an instance where you may want to submit to them a hard copy. And that way you're handing it to them, and they should take precautions to secure that information. But that's the best answer I have at this point.
That is a benefit of doing these workshops so far, is that we do get asked questions that, they're good questions, and we're kind of trying to get the information to follow up on that as we move forward with each following workshop. But that is a good question. I did want to point out for submission and implementation. So March 1st, submitting your EPP. It was mentioned earlier, please don't wait till February 20th or 28th or something like that, just to hit that deadline. Get it in because there's a lot of work that has to be done on the TCEQ side. They have a lot to review, and if you need to make any changes, they still need to come back to you. So get it in well before then. But implementation, July 1st. So the idea is that you should have whatever you're putting in your EPP in place by July. I know there are some questions and concerns, especially with supply and demand issues, generators, if you're going to buy a fixed generator or a mobile or any of the other options that may be impacted by supply issues or supply chain right now. There are concerns with that. And from my understanding that if TCEQ receives an implementation plan along with this to say that we're in the process, this is the schedule of events so far, we have ordered, this is the contract date that they're going to come out and actually install this, whatever the case may be, if you have that drawn out in a plan, from my understanding is that they will consider that along with for the implementation period. I'm not going to say it's just straight across the board approved, but they are going to be very understanding and considerate about the situations that are going on right now. I know talking with Taylor Power at a previous event that we did, that I think one of the systems, and it may be Levi, I believe I heard him in here earlier, had told me that they were 22 weeks out at that point when they ordered it. That was, so ordering it about 2 months ago, it was 22, 23 weeks at that time. So the more that people are actually getting on the ball with getting these EPPs looked at, considered what's going to happen, which option are we choosing, you can only imagine that the lead time to actually get generators are going to be extended. Estimated time. Yeah, no hard confirmed, it'll be there. Yeah. So keep that in mind as well. Now, it was mentioned earlier about there is an extension. It's a 90-day extension, but keep in mind that you get to pick the submission date or the implementation date for that extension. So it doesn't just carry it on through to both. Try to get your EPP done well before March, and if you think the implementation part is going to take you a little longer, submit for that extension for implementation period. Any questions? Yeah, what's weird is that this was pointed out once to me already, and I still didn't fix that. I did go through it trying to figure out where it was wrong, and it's 2021. This should say 2022, and I apologize for that. I'm just not ready to move on, I guess. Apparently, we're all late, so. All right, yeah, sorry for the errors. Thank you for pointing that out again. That is my fault. Any questions on the last segment so far? Any other errors? No, just fine. Okay, I think, are we doing mutual aid before lunch or after lunch? We do after. We seem to be quite early. Any other ideas? Lunch will be here at 11:45. So we have about 45 minutes until then. What's that? I think we have time to go ahead and move on. That way we can get out a little earlier and we have more time for the hands-on at the end.
Two comments I wanted to make before we go into mutual aid. One is keep in mind that the Senate Bill 3 only requires you to maintain 20 PSI. So on a couple of systems I have worked on, they were planning to have generators, one in particular, at all 3 of their water plants. And once we look at the system and hydraulics and everything, they actually only need to operate 1 water plant. They already had a generator at this particular plant, and it had the capacity to generate in excess of 20 PSI during an emergency. So a lot of people from the previous workshops as well, we've getting feedback, people thinking you have to have enough power to operate your whole system on the normal operations. That's just not the case. 20 PSI is the guideline. The other thought I'd like to have you consider in your mind while you're thinking about mission accomplishment, providing safe water to your customers 24/7, is a black sky event. Who knows what a black sky event is? Just show of hands. So Texas was that close from what I've heard and talked to various people at the PUC and also the hearings that resulted after URI, is that the reason why ERCOT made the decision to shut down the system is because we was about to enter into a black sky event. And that is when you are without power for multiple weeks. So like what we were saying at the beginning of the presentation, yeah, you want to comply with EPP, but that's just the first step. You want to start thinking about how I'm going to have mission accomplishment of provide safe water 24/7. What if we were to lose power for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, 3 months? What's going to be your plan? So start thinking about that. Sir?
Question.
My comment is under storage, it says 20 PSI MDD. That's a concern of mine. If it's storage, they're looking at maximum daily demand. Is that not setting us up for a problem under the template, under storage? They say 20 at maximum day. My point was the other component of the equation is at what demand rate. And the only thing I've saw so far is the MDD under storage. Following up of your comment that you didn't have to have all plants online, that's the driver, of course, is at what capacity. And that's got to get answered somehow, folks, for us all to have a comfort level. Is it at average day demand of your system? But if it is truly going to be at max day, I think it blows a lot of that type of thinking. Yes,
Yeah.
as it's written in this form today.
So yeah, that's a great point. So, not having it in front of me, but you wanna when you're using the storage option, really any of the options, you wanna look at what is the usage. What do you have to produce for that 20 psi? And that's not necessarily. Oh, thank you. That's not necessarily maximum daily demand, right? It probably isn't, honestly. And so that's a good point. To take that back and discuss that a little bit. But typically, when you're in an emergency situation, you would hope that you're using a lot less, right? And so,
Well, I mean, to that point, what we actually saw in our first period,
right.
2 to 3 times as much.
Yeah, I was wondering if someone was going to say that. Yeah. Exactly. So repeat what you just said.
Yeah, I was just pointing out that, what we saw, and I think everyone else did, is that during the Winter Storm Uri, which is, practical application of this issue we're talking about, is we saw usage rates 2 to 3 times what our normal winter usage rate would be. And so at the end of the day, no matter which method you're choosing, if you're trying to maintain 20 PSI, the only factor that matters is what demand rate you're calculating off that, right? So if we're going to submit these plans to the TCEQ based off a normal winter demand rate, right, and then they turn around and say, oh, nope, sorry, you need to use maximum for your system, that throws everything that we've worked 6 months for out the window.
Right. So.
And there's no guidance here that I know that we can see, to the man's point.
No, those are good points. We'll get to you just a second. So that will need to be evaluated again. So let's go back to the whole Winter Storm Uri thing, right? So what we're doing is a result of that. But there is an understanding that that event was way outside of the norm. And I don't think there's an expectation that you will plan for that type of event, that type of water. I mean, some folks had record water usage during that time, that they'd never seen that kind of demand before because of what was going on with people dripping faucets and filling up bathtubs and all the stuff to get prepped, right? And then, of course, just the temperatures themselves. So there's going to be some working with folks, right? And I would look at what your demand has been during what we would consider the normal emergencies we get, right? So like I keep going back to the initial program because that's all we had to reference. But the current program, Harrison, Fort Bend, they deal with, it's mostly hurricanes is what caused that one. And those type of events are typically what we get. And so when you're putting together your EPP and whatever option you utilize, if you have data from the normal events, right? If you have data on your emergency demand, because that's a column in the template, right? Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to add on what you're saying,
Yeah.
that if we look on page 5 of the template in section 5, where it says system demand, it actually tells you that you need to use your emergency operation demand in an average of the last 3 years. So that's kind of what we use. We use our demand from last year, this year, February, and then averaged it with our other 2 years prior to that.
Thank
so
you.
it kind of tells you there, the demand that you need to use. Yeah, I was just gonna.
No, I
add
appreciate that. Thank you for rescuing me on that one. But yes, so you need to look at, because, it's not realistic, I don't think, to plan for that kind of usage constantly, because I just don't think that's going to be real. And I could be completely wrong, and we'll hear about that next year. But look at what your system's done over the last 3 years, right? Look at if you have data on emergencies, if you have data on really high demand days, all that needs to be taken into account. It's sort of like if any of you have gone through the process to get an alternative capacity requirement, right? The requirements in the rules say you have to use 3 years worth of data. And in those instances, it says throw out the high demand things, the water main breaks, the firefighting. In this instance, I wouldn't throw those out. I would keep those in when you're trying to plan for this, because it can be an occurrence that happens in your system. And so, I think that's the best thing to do at this point, to try to plan for it, and plan for what you're going to do to keep your system up and running. There's also an option in here that I hope doesn't get overlooked, and that's option 13. And it talks about emergency water demand rules. And, a lot of times if your system is required to have a drought contingency plan, you have triggers based on how your system's operating to put in water use restrictions. You can do that outside of droughts too. You can do that during events where you have the potential for a really high demand. Put that in place. Now, to make that effective, what's that going to take? It's going to take communicating with your customers well before that event happens. You need to start educating them. Hey, this is what we're going to. This is what we have to do in these type of events. This is how we have to pull back on our water usage so everybody can have water. And so I think that is why option 13 was put in there as an option to help address some of these issues. Because if you can get your demand down, then your other option can work a little more effectively. So that's what I got. Go ahead.
I had a question, Elston. So how is this going to work with boil water notices and normal compliance requirements? Like, I'll give you an example. During Winter Storm Uri, I asked about TCR monitoring. If you were down for several weeks and you didn't get your back T sample, it was still a requirement to do that, even though you were not operating under normal parameters, and also in some cases under a boil water notice. And so that's not your normal way of operating. How is this all going to work with your EPP? And if you're under a boil water notice, if you're still like having blips where you're meeting 20 PSI or not because of line breaks or situations like that, and then with your normal compliance requirements, how is this all going to be considered by TCEQ?
That's a really good question on that. I don't want to speak for TCEQ on that kind of issue. I think you need to communicate with them on that if you have those issues coming in place. If you're in a situation where you're going to be disruptive in your water service and it's going to start hurting compliance or impacting the compliance with other rules and regulations, you need to talk to them about that. I'm not sure how that's going to be done, unfortunately. Y'all saved all the hard questions, didn't you? Yes, ma'am. Any other questions before we jump into mutual aid? That's really good. I appreciate that. And I mean, that's why we're here, right? To get these questions, at least get them out there. If I can't answer them, we can't answer them as a group, we definitely are taking note of it. We can go back and really try to get some answers to them and try to make this more effective for everyone.